Hello, everyone. This has been an absolutely amazing summit, and what just terrific programming and speakers. So this particular panel is extremely important for many reasons, given the demographic changes that we're seeing and the talent challenges in our country. So let me share some data points with you to provide some context. Women of color make up 39% of the nation's female population and 20% of the entire US population, and will be the majority in the workplace by 2060. And when we look at the workplace, while white women held about 1/3 of total management positions in the US, women of color held a far smaller share. And according to McKinsey's most recent research, for every 100 men who were promoted from entry level to management positions, only 87 women are promoted. Bad news. And only 82 women of color are promoted, which is even worse news. And few advance to leadership positions. In fact, as of 2022, 25% of C-suite leaders are white women, and only 5% are women of color, only 5%. And this lack of diversity in the C-suite is reflected in the board as well. Yet we know that women of color are ambitious, and you have several of them on this panel today, and they want to rise in their careers. McKinsey and Lean in their Women in the Workplace report actually cite that 83% of Asian women, 80% of Black women, and 76% of Latinas say that they want to be promoted, compared to 75% of men and 68% of white women in their study. And in a recent Forbes article, they cite that 41% of women of color want to be top executives. So this is not about lack of ambition, compared with 27% of white women. Now, even more concerning is research by Seramount, and you have Subha on this panel from Seramount, that shows that nearly 50% of women of color are open to leaving their organization. This is really, really troubling. And with the recent layoffs, it further threatens any gains that we've made. In fact, one study on tech layoffs actually found that women represented about 39% of the overall workforce, but 46% of all of the layoffs. And this is, definitely more than a revolving door. This is one step forward and 3 giant steps back. So although much of the gender-based data and research is reported in sort of binary terms, men versus women, we know that women's lived experiences are formed at the intersection of gender and race or ethnicity. And simply looking at women as a monolith can lose some of that nuance, because the struggles of white women in the workforce are not necessarily similar to those of Black working women, and in turn, Black working women may face entirely different barriers to those experienced by Hispanic or Asian women. And so to unpack these challenges, we have an absolutely stellar panel. We have with us today Subha Barry, CEO of Seramount. We have Heather Choi, Partner and Chief Diversity and Inclusion Officer with Baker Botts LLP. And we have Anand Dutra, CEO of Mandala Global Advisors and WBC Board Director. So welcome to all of you. I know this is going to be a phenomenal discussion, a lot to share. The sessions we had before this in preparation for this, I know that, we could have just gone on and on. So I'm going to ask you this first question to all of you. Women of color are clearly not a monolith, as I just said, and each of us as women of color have different experiences based on our identities. So can you share how you identify yourself and why this particular topic is important to you personally? So if you could just, let me just start with who I see on my screen, and that's Anna, and I'll go to Heather and then to Subha. So go ahead, Anna.
Well, first of all, good afternoon. It is a huge pleasure to be here among so many friends and among thousands of wonderful women and men, right? So, Rohini, to answer your question, identification is a very personal, complex, and relative issue. It is personal because there's not one size fits all. It is complex because it can be incredibly multidimensional. And it's relative because actually the way that the rest of the world identifies you or identifies us also impacts how we see ourselves, right? So let me give you a personal example. So I grew up in Brazil, in a family where on my father's side, we have indigenous blood. On my mother's side, we have European, and 2 generations back, we have Black. So in Brazil, believe it or not, I was super white, right? Because most of the population has darker skin than I have. So the way they saw me there, even though I'm in one of the most Latin countries and I had all this mix in my family, like when people ask me, I'm white. Then I came to the US, and I came to the US and I came to business school, and I was asked point blank, so do you want to be part of the LAHIMA or of the Black Management Association? And I like, so do I have to pick a team? And I had to pick a team. I said, well, I think that I'm more Latina than all the other options, so that's where I'll go. And if I think back about my 3 decades in the US, I can almost see different phases. I can see the first phase where all I wanted was to blend, right? I took accent reduction classes. I wanted to speak English at home. And then the second phase, I said, you know what? It is what it is. That's what makes me. I got more comfortable in my skin. And then in my third phase, I started to really enjoy and show up my heritage and talk about my multi-diverse background. But again, there was another factor that changed the way I presented myself and I identified. It was in 2016 when we started to see, without being political, but all the backlash against Latinos and immigrants. For the first time in my life, I caught myself saying, I am an immigrant in this country. At that moment, it was not the color of my skin, my heritage, where I was born, where my families came from, that mattered. What I wanted to say to everybody is, I am an immigrant with children, just like those other mothers whose children were taken away from them. I was just a luckier immigrant. I won't even say more educated, because there are so many educated immigrants who are not going anywhere because there are so many restrictions and they have to earn a living. So to your point, the issue of identification is super important, but it's so much more than just labeling people, because it is about how we feel, it is about our place in society, it is about our voice. And we can talk more about that, I'll be happy to. But that is my personal experience, and one that's meaningful to me, and I know to my children, because they do identify themselves as women of color, but daughters of immigrant parents.
That's great, Anna. Thank you, first of all, for making yourself vulnerable and sharing, such a personal example. So really appreciate it. And you're absolutely right. Identity is very contextual. How you experience your identity in one part of the world is very different from how you experience it in a different part of the world. And clearly issues of race and color and colorism are experienced very differently depending on where you are. So thanks for sharing that. And clearly it's important to you because of your children as well and how they are experiencing their identity. So appreciate it. Heather, let me ask you to answer the same question in terms of how you identify and why this is important, this topic.
Sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be here. Anna, I loved your response, because there's so much power, I think, in sort of declaring who you are, and maybe different facets of your identity kind of rise to the forefront depending on the context, political, geographic, you name it. But one of the things it made me think about is I'm a Black woman, and I'm Black everywhere I go in the world, in every room that I'm in. And so it's just an interesting thing to think about, because it's not something that I have ever had to say or declare or let people know, because it's something they can see. And that can be good or bad, depending on the situation, but it speaks to the different ways that women of color sort of move through society, in the sense that I can't pass, if you will, or it's not a part of myself that I suppose I can hide. This is an extremely important topic to me. I think one of the challenges that many women of color face, and I know has been one for me in particular, is very passionate about issues affecting women as a broader group. And I'm active in a lot of organizations, specifically legal organizations dedicated to sort of advancing women in the profession. And it can be a challenge. Sometimes I find myself maybe hesitating to chime in about how an issue being discussed might have a specific impact on Black women. But the same is true in organizations that are sort of focused on supporting and advancing African Americans in this country. Sometimes I find myself, saying, hey, no, you absolutely do need to speak up, because this might have a specific impact or implication on Black women that maybe Black men don't necessarily have top of mind. And then when you layer the immigrant experience of so many Black people in the United States on top of that, which is not an experience that I have personally. My ancestors, if you go back far enough, they were enslaved people in the southeastern United States. But I have many good friends who are also Black, but maybe who are first generation Americans or second generation. And so there's so many layers to this. And so I just think this is a really valuable conversation, and I'm happy to be a part of it.
Yeah, this is terrific, Heather, and thanks for sharing that. When you said what you just did, it reminded me of something, because you said that you're Black regardless of where you go, but that Blackness is experienced differently depending on the context. I know,
Absolutely.
Sort of colleagues and friends of mine who will say that when I go to some part of the world, yes, I'm Black, but along with that comes all of those things that are associated with being an American in a different part of the world, right? So the power dynamics, right? So in the United States, I don't have the same power dynamics, but when I move to a different part of the world, suddenly those power dynamics that are associated with being American is what's perceived. So I think, yeah, and the whole issue that you brought up about the sort of immigrant experience of your Black colleagues is a whole different area. Because I know one colleague saying to me that, in Africa, I was Kenyan, or I was from Nairobi, or my tribe or my ethnicity, but I never thought of my Blackness, right? Because I was part of the majority. So this is and that's what intersectionality is about. And that's really how, so I'm going to ask you the same question, Subha, to get your voice in, and then we'll move.
So I listened to what Anna and Jennifer and Heather had to share with us. And I thought to myself, we all have so many different identities, but along with those identities are experiences, and those two meld to create who we are. So I think of myself, I'm an immigrant Indian American woman. I'm a Hindu Brahmin. I'm a caregiver to my mother. I'm a wife to a white Irish Catholic man, a mother to two biracial children. I'm a driven professional leader who grew up in a male-dominated industry in financial services. I'm a 6-time cancer survivor who not only went through the chemotherapies and stem cell transplants, but clinical trials. And I'm a diabetic with terrible neuropathy. So I have a disability element to how I experience life. And now I'm a crusader for fairness and justice in our world. I think about all those intersections of gender, race, religion, immigration status, career choices, parent, caregiver, disabilities, etc. And these life experiences actually come together to shape who I've become. And, when my friend Jackie Glenn, I know some of you know her well, shared her experience as a Black woman and a spouse to a Black man and a grandmother to a baby Black boy. This is right after the George Floyd murder happened. It seared me to my core. And I'll tell you why. Because when she expressed her anxiety and her visceral fear. She would say when her husband left home and stepped out of the house to go to the grocery store, she was on the phone with him the entire time till he got back in the house. She was terrified of would he speed, would he be stopped, would he be, I mean, all kinds of fears. And this is a brave woman. This is a brave woman. It's something I had never experienced in my life, even though I'm an immigrant, even though, so what I learned that each one of us carries that baggage and burden of our gender, our race, and our community's history. And on top of it, all of our own personal anxieties and our experiences. And each of us is unique, and presuming that somehow because I'm an immigrant or I'm a woman or I'm really simply doesn't mean you understand someone else's burden. You can empathize, but even among women of color, our experiences are so unique. And I learned at that point in time that offering empathy, offering a shoulder to lean on, but somehow I can't say I know what it's like, because it truly isn't. And that's where I understood how unique each individual person's experience is, even though we're bundled together as women of color.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think, we are bundled together as women of color, and our experiences are extremely distinct, and we really need to listen to each other's lived experiences without dismissing. So that's great. Thank you for pointing that out and sharing that story as well, Subha. So, one of the things that I shared when I set the context was that, there is this revolving door, and women of color are ready to, leave the workplace. So in your mind, why do women of color have such low retention rates? And what are some of those challenges that women of color encounter in the workplace? From, maybe the perspective of your particular identity. So Subha, maybe I'll start with you on this question.
So I think what happens is people make assumptions and perceptions about our intellect, our abilities, our work ethic, our leadership capabilities. And all of these are usually either based on, something they read or saw somewhere, or maybe an example of some one or two people they've interacted with. And I always used to say to a person, if you've interacted with one woman of a particular unique ethnicity, a woman of color, you have that one experience. Don't imagine that that applies broadly to everybody. So for example, when you think about Asians, we're thought of as being good at math and science and technology. I assure you, not all of us are, okay? And the other thing that's interesting is that there's an assumption that we don't innately have adequate leadership capabilities. When you look at college admissions, for example, we are not the model for what is seen as a leader. And guess, many of us are, and we have great leadership capabilities. And then the same assumptions derail other women of color. Think about the lack of role models, coaches, and mentors, and think about how that impacts someone's career progression. Think about performance evaluations and the measuring rods that are so subjective, that are biased, and really do not have enough friction points interjected into them. And I think about the gap between gender and race as one that can be, I always draw this picture of a bridge and say, a white man to a white woman is one bridge, the gender bridge. A white man to a man of color is one bridge. It's the race bridge. A white man to a woman of color, it is two bridges, a gender and race bridge. And I call it a bridge too far, because all of a sudden it becomes something that they can't wrap their heads around to say it's too complex. And I think women of color are disproportionately also caregiving for the elderly and extended communities. I know in my case, it's not just parents, it's uncles, aunts, and even extended neighbors, close neighbors that become family to us. It's true for Asians, it's true for Hispanics, it's true for Blacks. And we need more flexibility in terms of how we do our work. And we often don't get it. The assumptions are made that somehow, as we're all being dragged back into work, that we'll figure it out. It's not quite as easy. Even pre-pandemic, our study showed, you mentioned that, Rohini, that 50% of multicultural women were considering leaving their companies. And among that, Black women actually were the most ambitious in our study. And at entry level, they were 25% more likely to aspire to senior leadership roles when compared to their white counterparts. And guess what? Then they always make the statement, right? Oh, yeah, most of the small businesses are started by women of color. Let us not wear that as a badge of honor.
Mm-hmm.
Let us wear that as a badge that says corporate America does not treat women of color well enough, and that's why they're leaving. They do not feel included. They are not accepted in the same way, and they don't have the networks that can support them and nurture them. That's why they leave, not because starting a small business is such a bed of roses, because if it surely isn't. So I would say to you that, corporate America needs to take a good, hard look inside itself to say, why are we failing women of color?
Great, thank you. That's powerful. Why are we failing women of color? And look at the loss in terms of talent, in terms of innovation, in terms of creativity. I mean, at a time when we need the best possible talent, and the assumptions, the unconscious biases that get in the way of getting women of color and keeping women of color. And I think you mentioned another piece, which to me was very interesting when you talked about Asian women, and you were talking about yourself and the assumptions. This whole notion of the model minority is a double-edged sword, right? On the one hand, Asian women are seen as great individual contributors, as hardworking, but on the other hand, that same model minority myth leads to the assumption that they're not good leaders. Mm-hmm. So, clearly, these assumptions definitely get in the way. So let me, Heather, turn to you and ask you, and the same question in terms of the low retention rates and the challenges for women of color in the workplace. Can you add, from your perspective?
I think one of the things that's a challenge is if it were, I think white men who were disproportionately, leaving corporate America in droves, the reaction would be, well, let's figure out, we have a systemic issue and let's figure out a systemic solution. But when you start talking about women and women of color in particular, often if you raise the issue of kind of the retention or the attrition rates, people respond with the individual circumstances of people who left. Well, she left because of family. She left to relocate closer to home, or she moved into a different industry altogether. We're all individual people. Everyone has a story, but all the pieces add up, and there are very clearly trends and something larger going on. And so I think one of the challenges is just getting leaders to wrap their heads around, we need to think about this holistically. And a lot of times, I think that sort of D&I challenges are really talent management challenges. And so wherever there are issues in how you overall kind of manage the people in your organization, they're just going to have a disproportionate impact on women of color in particular.
Yeah, that's a really important point that you made, Heather, in terms of, sort of seeing this as individual issues, right? She had little kids. She couldn't relocate because, whatever. I mean, there's always a personal reason that's associated with a woman of color versus seeing, what is the systemic reason that this is happening? And we're seeing this trend. So let's fix, the systems and not just talk about, the personal pieces, the individual pieces. So really good point. So I'm going to ask you, in terms of, clearly, the data suggests that women of color sort of feel this lack of belonging to the workplace. So if you can sort of talk about that and, what are those experiences that impede the inclusion and belonging for women of color? And maybe if you have any personal stories that you can share in terms of, why, and if you've had any experiences to that effect.
Yeah, so first of all, I want to say that it's hard to add anything to what Subha and Heather just said, right? But the one thing that I would add, and in particular because this is a panel with 4 women of color, is that we are not asking for any special treatment. We're just asking for 2 things. One is fairness, and the other one is joint problem solving, right? Because if you start to see representatives of a particular segment living in drones, and you actually translate that to how your customers, how your prospective employees, how your business partners will feel by seeing that, then now we have not just a social issue, we have a business issue, right? But to your point about the feeling of belonging, I think that the first thing that reduces or prevents a strong feeling of belonging is actually not seeing at the top in corporations other women who look, who feel, and who are experienced by others like us, right? It's very discouraging. If you look up and all you see is white guys, all you see is white women, the immediate question is this my home? Is this a place for me? I don't have anybody up there who is silently sending me a message that I can make it too, right? Then we talked about the other cultural differences, which is what I would call it. For example, for most of us, being expected to take care of multiple generations in our family. I'll tell you, for Latinos, children don't leave your house typically until they get married. And I wonder if it's the same in other cultures as well. So that means that you are no longer responsible, but you are still responsible for them, right? And if in addition to that, you are not feeling respected and appreciated for the differences and for the special things you bring to the table in your job, at some point you start to ask yourself, is this pain worth it, right? Is feeling like anything that I ask for is asking for some privilege or some special treatment, as opposed to, this is something that I deserve, that I have the right to ask for. And I always say, do ask, because what's the worst thing that can happen? You got to know, and then you know it's a no, right? But when you put all that together, that does impact sense of belonging. And I'll tell you what, if you, on top of everything we're talking about, you add the multi-generational layer to it, then we have a hot mess, right? Because this new generation is not going to stay, regardless of the color of their skin or their background. They are not going to stay anywhere if they don't feel that they belong there. So I'm going to pause here with that. I think all of us in this call have children or nieces, and I'll invite you to just observe their behaviors.
You're absolutely right. I think, this is about future talent as well. Women of color, future talent, like you, I have 2 daughters. And I can tell you that, when my daughters chose where they wanted to work, one of them is a lawyer. When she decided on the law firm she wanted to work at, it was very clear if she didn't see people like herself, other women of color at the top, she was not going to take that, regardless of what they enticed her with. So it's a big, big loss to organizations. Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up, Anna. So Heather, from your perspective, in terms of this sort of belonging, lack of belonging that women of color feel, can you sort of share any personal stories and why?
I have been at my law firm for 16 years, and I'm in my early 40s. So for my generation in that environment, 16 years is a very, very long time. I'm hard pressed to think of a peer from my law class who is still working in the same law firm. And what strikes me when I think about my own experience is that it actually doesn't take that much for you to feel like you belong. And so much of it has already been mentioned when it comes to having role models. I mean, there are 3 women who come to mind right away that if someone said, why are you still there? They are why I'm still here.
Yeah.
Because they were people who took me under their wing, who I could go to. And and I'm not talking about decades older than me, but two of them now are in the highest senior leadership positions we have at the firm. And just seeing a path, I think a lot of times people maybe who aren't women of color underestimate the importance of being able to see someone a little bit ahead of you doing the things that you aspire to do. So it is, I think of it as an uplifting point that it honestly does not take that much, but also a little disheartening because so often even that little bit isn't there.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I think, I often say that change happens at the intersection of people and processes, right? So you've got to have the systems changes in order to retain women of color, but you also need those personal pieces, right? So individuals need to be self-aware and know how to welcome others into the workplace. And it takes those little things of, micro inequities that become huge that can disengage women. But you can also do things, very small things, to create that belonging. So thank you. So Subha, I'm going to ask you, I know you have some personal experiences that you can share. And then I'll switch to the next question because I know we're sort of tight on time here.
So I grew up in financial services, and as you can imagine, very few women and even fewer women of color in the organization. And I always used to think to myself, I was very competitive and I was successful early on in my career, in spite of having sort of a pronounced accent, and they hadn't yet come up with flat iron. So my hair was very frizzy. And in every way, I didn't fit the mold of who should be on Wall Street doing what I did. But what was interesting was, being in a job where you can get measured objectively essentially allowed you to have your results speak for you. So my results said I was a good producer. And they always used to have these sort of awards and trips, and small and large. And every month, whoever were the top 5 producers would get the opportunity to go to the box at Yankee Stadium, and some senior leader at Merrill would be there. And you got a chance to interact with them and get time with them, etc. And across the board, every single time, whenever I was one of the top 5, they would say to me, Subha, we'll give you an Amex card to go to dinner with your husband. Wouldn't you prefer that? So the bias there that said, you're not going to really enjoy what we guys do in there. You don't really want to be riding with us. And, who were they really looking out for? It surely wasn't me. And I always used to think that, it felt like it was death by 1,000 cuts, because it was a small thing, but the ability to go on that ride from Princeton to the Yankee Stadium, to sit in the box where often the CEO would show up, where I never got that chance. You think about that. That is one example that sticks with me. And I made sure that when I got to be successful enough, I said, you either change where you go or you don't exclude the women. I don't know which one you pick, but you pick one of those two. So that sort of gives you an idea of how there are so many different ways in which women can get excluded, and how that lack of belonging starts to build all along in your career.
Yeah, it's a drip, drip, drip that adds up. And then you have women saying, I'm starting my own business, which is not something to kind of, be cheering about, because it says something about them not feeling a sense of belonging. So I'm going to start asking you to do your closing comments. So Heather, I'm going to start with you. And so it's two-part question. One is, just share any sort of strategies or recommendations that you have for companies who want to increase the numbers of women of color in their pipeline, and any other closing thoughts or advice for, for leaders and women of color in listening into us.
I think I would, really just kind of go back to something that was mentioned earlier about how much of this really is about how you develop talent more broadly, and where you have weaknesses in your processes, you're going to have disproportionate impacts on women of color. So I know Subha earlier mentioned, performance evaluations. Well, there are better and worse ways to do that. I would say on the worst end is zero structure at all and just encouraging managers to take the time to talk to their direct reports about how they're doing. On the other end of the spectrum, there are ways, and there's lots of research to support kind of the right questions to ask, how to structure a feedback interview, how to make sure that people are really getting the information they need to grow, develop, and hopefully be promoted. Because it sounds obvious, but it's really worth saying, when you don't have that kind of process in place, the people who are going to get the short end of the stick with respect to concrete, actionable feedback and development are going to be the women of color. Whereas affinity bias will just start to kick in, and maybe, you know, at the event that excludes women, someone will have a conversation that's like, you know, that presentation you did was pretty good, but here are 3 things that would have made it great. There are no women in the room, no opportunities for women to have that type of relationship. They're not going to get that advice. And over time, you will start to see quality gaps in performance, but it's not because the women aren't as smart or aren't as driven. It's because of failures and kind of the opportunities to let everyone succeed.
Great. So putting some of those checks and balances in the systems, because otherwise affinity bias kicks in. So thank you. So Anna, for you, you know, sort of this, you know, with the SCOTUS ruling on affirmative action in higher education, what is it that you think, if anything, organizations should do differently to ensure that we continue to have this robust pipeline of multicultural women? And then add to that any sort of closing thoughts that you have or advice for those on this call.
So let's start with the SCOTUS ruling, right? Of course, organizations can do different things. I mean, for one, you have to use your leverage. For two, you do care about the pipeline, right? But if you think about what drives higher ed organizations, at the end of the day, it's performance and ranking measurements. For them, is tied to the percentage of their students who are placed in meaningful jobs after graduation, as well as grants and donations from companies, right? So my advice to companies is use your leverage, use your power of the purse to request more diverse students, a pool of more diverse students. You have the power of hiring, you have the power of donating, and you have the power of providing grants. That should be just enough to give you some clout with those organizations. So I think the power at this point is actually in the hands of the organizations, companies, institutions who are going to recruit and donate and support those higher ed education. So I'm in the no excuses zone here. It is your responsibility more than anybody else's. In terms of closing advice to our audience, I would say that first and foremost, because we talked about so many setbacks and challenges and barriers here, is do not get discouraged, right? Approach everything we're talking about here as an opportunity for growth, as an opportunity to make a difference, as an opportunity to establish yourself as a leader. The second point is ask for what you need, for what you want. Self-advocacy can only help. There's no harm in it. As I said, the worst thing that can happen is you got to know. You ask somebody to mentor you and that person says, no, I don't have any time. Is that the mentor you really wanted? I don't think so, right?
That's great.
And then the last one, and I always say this to my children, is be curious about each and every opportunity or conversation or new relationship that comes your way, right? And when faced with something that you can try, again, ask yourself, what's the worst thing that can happen? I always say, provided it doesn't include death, prison, or bankruptcy, just don't burn any bridges and go for it. So that's why we're here. We took a chance on something, right?
Take a risk. That's excellent. Thank you. So Subha, for you, sort of closing thoughts for those on this call, and how, this is an important one. Any thoughts you have on how we can be allies to each other as women of color? Because yes, we have different experiences, but there's a lot that we share.
Well, I would say to you, know yourself. I always say, and you don't remain the same person. So know yourself, as you're iterating and growing. And deliberately expand your networks to include people who don't look like you, especially start with other women of color. If you don't have enough of them in your network, create them. Tell your stories, tell other people's stories. And lastly, I would say to you, be observant about unfairness and be courageous to speak up against it. And sometimes speaking up on behalf of someone else is actually easier than speaking up just for yourself.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you to each one of you, Anna, Heather, Subha. Well done. Thank you very much. And I know this is going to be an ongoing conversation, so stay tuned. Thank you.